Hey guys, this is Tauna. Today we're going to be talking about pulling apart your commander decks. This is something that I have recently been doing. I have a lot of commander decks. I think I added it up just then, and it's above 50 over the course of, playing and stuff like that. And some of them have been very, very different decks in the past and have slowly kind of been changing. There's been some recently that I've been pulling apart, which has been the focus of my last few months, myself going through my decks and kind of testing them, seeing if I do entirely like them or how I kind of feel about them and everything. But we're going to go through some examples now. There's definitely one of these that I'm going to be pulling apart and some that I'm kind of tossing up. And then there's one that I've pulled apart, but then kind of while I pulled it apart, it's not completely pulled apart. It's more like I completely transition it. So I'm going to talk about a few different kind of ways to help decide if you want to pull your deck apart or if you want to kind of keep it together or what exactly you kind of want to do with it. So I'm going to start first of all with one that I am definitely kind of pulling apart. And I'm going to talk about why I am and what my thoughts are about and everything. And this one here is Nari Fable Singer. Now, while there is obviously a possibility that I could kind of, build this with a new commander and everything, I played through with this deck, and one of the kind of, let's break it down. There's a number of different reasons why you would want to pull apart a deck. And the first one here is going to be about the actual deck, right? So this is going to be, you don't enjoy that deck altogether. And Nari Fable Singer was one of those for me, because of the fact that it is built around enchantments, around sagas, specifically enchantments. But I just felt that sagas were incredibly dirtily. Now, if I wanted to, there is a few different like saga commanders that I could potentially turn this into. However, with like my play style, sagas are just something that I'm not hugely interested in by default. What do I mean by default? Just sagas in general as like the overarching theme of a deck and enchantments, I am just not a huge fan of. However, I do have an idea on what I want to do with this deck, but what didn't I enjoy about it? Nari was, an interesting deck, but there was just a huge amount of things kind of going on. And once I got into playing it and going through, there was a few different things in here that were creating like clones of enchantments, specifically around the, the 3 blind mice. I was able to get almost an infinite out because I had the 3 blind mice, and they were able to clone. And then I had a clone of 3 blind mice. And then I was able to kind of get to the point that I was just kind of getting clones and stuff like that. And then each of those clones coming in, we're getting a whole bunch of different triggers from a bunch of other things in the deck. There was just a lot going on with it. Now, don't get me wrong. That's not going to be like all of these ones that I'm talking about here. While they aren't something that I enjoy personally, I do know that other people will definitely kind of enjoy them, right? And I could easily turn this around away from, having the sagas, the sagas purely being the focus, or I could change it to not having as many kind of cloning effects onto the sagas, creating, token copies of them and everything. And that would be perfectly okay. And I could potentially enjoy that. However, the way that I play Magic the Gathering is very combat focused, and I enjoy kind of combat focused and kind of aiming towards, just beating people down and stuff. And there is a way to do that with sagas, which is what I'm going to be turning this one into, which is going to be into Sigurd Jarl of a Ravensthorpe here, the one from Assassin's Creed, that is based around +1/+1s and sagas. And that's kind of the way that I'm thinking about kind of going with it. Now, don't get me wrong, there's ways that this deck could be more enjoyable and people would enjoy it. But personally, just kind of after playing through it, I was not a big fan of it. And that's why one thing that you should definitely be doing before you go and purchase decks and build decks is testing them before you do that, because that way you're not going and spending a whole bunch of money on, a bunch of singles that you're not potentially going to be using, or, building a deck that once you start playing with it, you just don't really enjoy it. But I think that one thing that people do think is, that kind of sunk cost fallacy. Look, I've bought this commander, I've built it, I've, bought all the singles for it and kind of, upgraded this precon or whatever you kind of went with it. I should really be enjoying this, right? Like, or even like playing a deck like playing a deck and it's like, either this is my favorite colors, this is combat focus, this is what I like, and then it just doesn't end up kind of gelling with you. I think not being afraid to kind of pull apart a deck is a big thing, because once you kind of get to the point that you're like, hey, I'm not enjoying this deck, and it's kind of sitting around in your cupboard, those are things like, those are cards that are sitting there that could be doing something else, could be going into other decks, whether they're, being rebuilt into a new commander, like I'm going to be doing with my Nasi, kind of building into that Sigurd deck. Or it could be, taking some of these singles here and being like, okay, so what have I got in here? Like an enchantment creatures deck. I could potentially build like an enchantment creatures deck, or, Carmen can come out of here and go into, which is probably where she's going to end up going into, my Baitor deck that I'm building. There's ways to be able to make use of this stuff here in just a way that's going to be more enjoyable for yourself, that's not going to be sitting around in a box. So I guess point number one is not enjoying the deck. If you don't enjoy the deck altogether, either look at changing it into a deck that you're going to be enjoying by whether, changing some stuff up, or just pulling it apart and building it into something new, like, a big kind of Sagas change. Like, if you've got a Sagas deck, change it into a different Sagas, different colors, or doing something different with the Sagas or something. Because this one here is very much focused around, the Sagas resolving, going to the graveyard, being sacrificed, etc. So, next one I think that I'm going to talk about is my Koss one. So this is my Koss deck that I very recently have built and kind of changed from a previous deck. So number two is not enjoying the commander here. So my Koss deck was previously a Felix 5 boots deck, and it was very much focused around that combat damage and kind of swinging in, dealing combat damage, and getting a whole bunch of different triggers off various different things, right? It was built from the Theft deck from OTC, and just kind of built up from there. And it worked relatively well, right? Like it got what it wanted to do going. It was enjoyable to play, but I just kind of felt that Felix was not the best choice for commander. He just kind of is the rest of your deck does things better commander, and I felt that there was a better option than him. And as soon as the new Koss got revealed, and as soon as I kind of went through and play tested this deck again, I realized, look, I could take this deck, change a few cards around, and then I could build up a better Koss deck from it. There is a lot of the previous deck still in here. Some of it obviously got changed when I, changed it up, and some was just pure upgrades that I had sitting around that should have been in here to start off with. Ways just to add some more unblockable and everything like that in here. Added in a kind of like a couple mana dorks and stuff. But most of the deck was kind of still there. It went a little bit more kind of in the direction of Voltron-esque, but it was just the change of commander, and the change of commander can do a huge, huge difference to your deck. If you've got let's just say a green elves deck, right? If we've got a green elves deck and we have a look at elves here for mono green, there are so many different elf commanders that you could potentially choose. Some are obviously going to be more viable than others, but just changing the commander of your deck could have a huge impact on how much you enjoy it, just because you purely have access to a different commander then, that could be very, very different and kind of make the deck kind of play differently, despite the fact that you don't need to change all that much between the two decks. So while this is not kind of, pulling apart your deck, it is pulling apart part of it to kind of change it slightly into just a new commander, which I think is another thing you just have to kind of, be aware of when new commanders come out. Just have a look at your decks and be like, while I do enjoy this commander, I think that there's just one that I would enjoy a lot more, and look at kind of changing it over potentially. So far we've got not enjoying the deck altogether. Definitely kind of look at pulling apart. Not enjoying the commander. You just, shift it over to a new commander and have a look at, shop around at commanders. There's a bunch of different commanders. The next one here is my Vren the Relentless deck, and I'm still kind of on the fence of this one if I'm going to play, kind of keep it together. I've talked about it in the past, but this is the table doesn't enjoy my deck, right? Like the rest of the game, nobody enjoys kind of playing against this. I've had one game where this was absolutely it was a terrorist at the deck at the table, right? No one liked it. It was really bad for so many different people because it just purely blocked people out of the game. And while, you know, they should have more interaction potentially to kind of deal with it, Vren also has Ward 2, so it is a lot more difficult for people to be able to deal with it. So I took this one here. The game that was absolutely a slog and people didn't like was against Imatech, which is very much around graveyard and, you know, playing with the graveyard and sacrificing your creatures, aristocrats. And then the other one was a Merin of Clan Neltoth deck, which again, you know, is very much wanting to kind of play around the graveyard and stuff. Now, that could have been a fluke and stuff like that with the Vren, definitely. But the way I've kind of built the deck up is very much around, just getting, like, it's removal tribal, essentially. It's removal tribal. We've got heaps of instants to remove creatures and destroy creatures. We've got a large number of kind of like, you know, board wipes and stuff because we get a bunch of board wipes. We've got, you know, a whole bunch of one-sided board wipes like Kindred Dominance and, you know, Overwhelming Forces. If you target someone with that, you know, there's a bunch of ways to just remove opponents' creatures with it. And that kind of, you know, takes the toll on people. And don't get me wrong, some people, it should just be like, hey, you know, I'm playing this deck. You just got to suck it up. You know what you're in for. But I enjoy playing decks that are fun for the rest of the table as well, and I'm not sure that Vren was it. I have played it, you know, another time since then, and it was a little bit better, but it also very quickly turned me into like the arch enemy because I had these, you know, 15 big black rats, and then it's like, you know, they've got to board wipe them, and then potentially I could build that back up, you know, in turn or two's time. Once people started rebuilding their boards, then it's like, hey, we're board wiping again. Hey, we're board wiping again. And it just, you know, ends up feeling bad. So whether it's probably Vren may not be kind of the best choice for it, but I know I've heard a fair few people saying it about the new Deadpool as well, because of the way the new Deadpool works. It's completely kind of, you know, removing people's abilities on their commanders and stuff. So it ends up being like, hey, my commander's not doing anything, or hey, my deck's not doing anything now because you've just switched all of it and stuff, and, you know, complaining about the fact that Deadpool's not fun. Deadpool's one that even if it's not fun for other people, I'm going to probably still keep it together, and it's just one that I'm not going to play as often, but Vren's just kind of on the chopping block of, hey, potentially going to be pulled apart. All right, so the last one here I'm going to talk about is going to be my Brimaz deck, which is a deck that I really want to make work, but I can't figure it out. And I'm not sure entirely what I'm kind of missing here. I don't know if it's just that I've had bad games with it or not. And it's one that I'm going to continue testing until I can figure it out, or I just end up pulling it apart. So this is going to be one that the deck just doesn't work well despite the fact that you want it to. So my Brimaz deck is built around Phyrexian tribal. So we've got like just, you know, all the creatures are different Phyrexians and stuff. I've got a number of different ways to kind of do +1/+1 counters with it. We've got, you know, Mondrak's in here. I very rarely will splurge out for a card, but Mondrak was one that I did. And it's purely because Mondrak was a Phyrexian and kind of synergized really well with the deck. I have a feeling that the reason that this deck is not working is just because the way I've been playing it is focusing more on the incubators and wanting those incubators to kind of go off and everything. But it just kind of ends up feeling like I'm not doing all that much, or I'm sitting there with like, you know, 5 incubators that have +5/+5, like 5 counters on them. And I just don't have enough mana to be able to flip them and be able to do stuff. So this is one that, you know, just requires more testing to see if I wanted to keep it together. But it's also one that I'm very heavily attached to. So I guess the last kind of point I want to make here is just because a deck is potentially not doing what it's meant to do, or, you know, you're not enjoying it, or it doesn't feel like it's going anywhere, doesn't mean that you do necessarily need to pull it apart. Just try and figure out what's wrong with it. And that's what my Brimaz one is currently sitting at. Like, there is something that I'm missing from it that I'm not entirely sure where it is or not. It just ends up, yeah, kind of dawdling at the table and sitting there with a whole bunch of incubators and everything. Maybe I just need more synergies between my different Phyrexians and focus less on the incubators. But I also wanted to kind of keep those incubators and proliferate. So who knows? I'll figure it out eventually. And then once I do, it's going to be an absolute nightmare for people, because I can already see that it can become that pretty easily. So yeah, just... I guess my advice is, one, don't be too afraid to pull apart your decks. If you have a deck that you're not enjoying at all, and, you know, whether it's you don't enjoy the way it plays, whether you don't enjoy, you know, how it affects other people at the table or how they kind of enjoy it, don't be afraid to kind of pull it apart. And, or, you know, if it's, you know, you're playing your deck and you're like, this commander doesn't feel great, or, you know, there's slight aspects of it, like I really enjoy this kind of, you know, combat focused deck, but the commander's not doing all that much, and I feel like, you know, the commander actually just isn't kind of suited to it enough. Don't be afraid to change it over to a new commander, change about, you know, a few different cards for it and see as to how that plays then. But also, you know, if you have a pet deck that you enjoy a lot, feel free to kind of keep it together and stuff and figure out what exactly is missing from it. But that's it for today, guys. I hope you guys had a great day, and goodbye.